"Open your legs, let me see," the lonely rancher ordered. But when the giant mail order bride did, he froze, realizing she'd never been touched, despite being married 3 times. "Open your legs, let me see." The lonely rancher's command cut through the lamplight of their wedding night like a blade, and Temperance Coldwell, all 6 feet 2 inches of her, felt her world narrow to those 5 words. She'd heard similar orders before, in 3 different marriages, from 3 different men. But tonight was different. Tonight, Dalton Fairweather wasn't asking. He was a rancher who'd been alone for 8 brutal winters, a widower who'd ordered a mail-order bride the way other men ordered fence posts, practical, necessary, without sentiment. She was the giant woman no man had ever wanted to keep. The bride who'd stood at 3 altars and left 3 marriage beds untouched, her body a mystery even to herself at 29. When she obeyed, when this giant mail-order bride slowly opened her legs on that cold December night in Montana Territory, the lonely rancher froze. His rough hands stopped mid-reach, his breath caught. His eyes widened with something that looked like horror, or perhaps recognition, as he realized what 3 husbands before him had either never discovered or never cared to know. She'd never been touched, not once, not ever, despite being married 3 times. But why would a woman married 3 times remain untouched? What had those husbands seen, or failed to see, that made them leave this giant bride unclaimed? And what did this lonely rancher see in that frozen moment that changed everything he thought he knew about the business arrangement he'd just made? What secret did her body hold that 3 marriages couldn't unlock? And why did the loneliest man in Montana Territory look at his giant mail-order bride with something that wasn't desire or disgust, but something far more dangerous, something that looked almost like tenderness? The bedroom was so cold, Temperance could see her breath, but sweat ran down her spine anyway as she sat on the edge of the brass bed, her hands gripping the worn quilt so hard her knuckles went white. Dalton Fairweather stood 3 feet away, his shadow enormous on the log wall behind him, his face half hidden in lamplight and darkness. He'd been direct from the moment he'd picked her up at Bozeman Station that afternoon. No pleasantries, no romance, just brutal honesty that she'd almost appreciated after years of pretty lies from men who couldn't follow through. "I need to know this marriage is real," he'd said in the kitchen earlier, after they'd eaten their wedding supper of beans and bacon in silence. "Legal and binding, which means it needs to be consummated. I'm not doing this for pleasure. I'm doing it because the law requires it, and because I need a wife who can work, not a companion I'm protecting from gossip." His voice had been flat, emotionless, the voice of a man who'd forgotten how to feel anything but exhaustion and duty. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" She'd understood perfectly. This wasn't about love or desire, or even basic human connection. This was about survival. His ranch was failing. She'd seen that the moment they'd arrived in the darkness, the leaning barn and broken fences, and the desperate emptiness of a man barely holding on. He needed help. She needed a home. And the state of Montana required that a marriage be consummated to be legal, to protect both parties from fraud. So here they were. "Take off your dress," Dalton said now, and his voice was rougher than before, like he was forcing the words out. "I need to examine you." Temperance's hands moved to the buttons running down her back, but they were shaking so badly she couldn't grip them properly. After 3 failed attempts, Dalton made an impatient sound and stepped behind her. His fingers were surprisingly gentle as they worked the buttons free, one after another, from her collar down to her waist. She felt the dress loosen, felt the bodice gape open, and she pressed her hand to her chest to keep it from falling completely. "Caroline used to make me do this," Dalton said quietly, still behind her, his breath warm on the back of her neck. "Said her fingers were too cold in winter to manage all these damn buttons." His voice caught slightly on his dead wife's name, and Temperance felt something twist in her chest. Not jealousy exactly, but a sharp awareness that she was a replacement, a substitute, a woman hired to fill a space that still belonged to someone else. "I can manage from here," she whispered. Dalton stepped back, and she heard him move to the window, giving her a moment of privacy. She stood and let the dress fall, then stepped out of it in her chemise, corset, and petticoats. Her fingers worked the corset laces. She'd learned to dress and undress herself years ago, because waiting for help meant depending on people who didn't want to be depended on. The corset dropped. The petticoats followed, until she stood in nothing but her thin cotton chemise, her body outlined clearly in the lamplight. She was big. She'd always been big. Tall and broad-shouldered and heavy-breasted and thick-thighed in ways that made other women whisper and men look away. At church socials, she'd been the girl no boy wanted to dance with because she was taller than most of them. At her first wedding, her husband Benjamin had looked at her with nervous awe, like she was a horse he wasn't sure he could ride. At her second wedding, Horace had seemed confident until he wasn't. And at her third wedding, Marcus had barely looked at her at all. "I'm ready," she said, and was proud that her voice didn't shake. Dalton turned from the window. His eyes traveled down her body slowly, clinically, the way a rancher might assess livestock at auction. She waited for the disgust, the disappointment, the inevitable moment when he'd realize he'd made a mistake, ordering a bride site unseen based on nothing but a brief letter and a blurry photograph. But he just nodded. "Lie down on the bed, on your back." She did, the quilt rough beneath her shoulders, the mattress sagging slightly in the middle. The ceiling above her was rough-hewn logs, and she focused on counting them as Dalton approached the bed. 1, 2, 3, 4. "Pull up your chemise," he said. "To your waist." Her hands fisted in the thin fabric, and for a moment she couldn't move. This was it. This was the moment every marriage came down to, the moment of revelation, of vulnerability, of truth. Benjamin had died before this moment. Horace had failed at this moment. Marcus had refused this moment entirely. What would Dalton do? She pulled the chemise up slowly, exposing her legs, her thighs, the most intimate parts of herself to this stranger who was now her husband. The cold air hit her skin and she shivered, but she kept her eyes on the ceiling. 5 logs, 6, 7. "Now open your legs," Dalton said, and his voice had changed. There was a thickness to it now, a strain. "Let me see." Temperance closed her eyes and obeyed. She felt herself opening, exposing, offering up the last piece of privacy she'd ever have. She waited for his hands, for the inevitable pain everyone said came the first time. For the moment when this lonely rancher would finally claim what 3 husbands before him had left untouched. But instead, she heard him suck in a sharp breath. Then silence. Long, terrible silence. She opened her eyes and found him standing frozen at the foot of the bed, his face gone pale in the lamplight, his hands suspended in midair like he'd been about to reach for her. But something had stopped him. His eyes were fixed between her legs, but the expression on his face wasn't desire or even clinical interest. It was shock. Pure, absolute shock. "You really weren't lying," he whispered. "You've never—" "No," she said, and humiliation burned through her chest. "I told you I hadn't. Why would I lie about that?" "3 marriages," he said, still staring, still frozen. "You've been married 3 times, and nobody ever—" He trailed off, shaking his head like he couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. "How is that possible?" Temperance sat up quickly, yanking her chemise back down, her face burning with shame. "My first husband died of a heart attack on our wedding night before we could consummate. My second husband tried for 3 months and couldn't manage it. He said I was too big, too much woman, that my body wasn't made right for a man. The doctors agreed when they examined me for the annulment. They said I had natural impediments. Her voice cracked. My third husband never tried at all because he was in love with someone else, a man, and only married me as a cover. So yes, Mr. Fairweather, I'm 29 years old, and I've never been touched. I'm sorry if that's disappointing, or if it means I'm broken, but that's what you bought when you sent for a mail-order bride from the charity agency. Broken. Dalton's voice was hoarse. He finally moved, but instead of reaching for her, he sat down hard on the edge of the bed, his back to her. His shoulders were shaking slightly. Jesus Christ, Temperance. Those doctors were either blind or lying to your husband's face. There's nothing wrong with you. Nothing at all. She blinked, confusion cutting through her shame. What? I've helped birth calves and foals for 20 years. I know what anatomy is supposed to look like. He scrubbed his hands over his face. There's no impediment, no abnormality. You're intact, completely intact. Which means your second husband was either impotent or a coward who blamed you for his own failings. He turned to look at her over his shoulder, and his eyes were no longer cold or clinical. They were angry. And those doctors signed off on an annulment based on a lie because it was easier than admitting a man's weakness. They let you believe you were defective when you're not. Temperance couldn't breathe. The room spun around her. But Horace was a liar. Dalton stood and paced to the window, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. And I was about to be worse than him. I was about to treat you like livestock, like a business transaction that needed verification and validation. I was going to... He stopped, his voice breaking. I was going to examine you like you were property I needed to inspect before accepting delivery. Isn't that what I am? Temperance heard herself ask. You ordered a mail-order bride. I came with a contract and a price. You have every legal right to verify what you paid for. Legal right doesn't make it moral. Dalton turned back to her, and she saw something in his face she hadn't seen all day. Genuine emotion, raw and unguarded. You were terrified. I could see you shaking. I could see tears on your face even though you were trying to hide them. And you did it anyway because 3 men before me taught you that your feelings don't matter, that your body is just something to be used or rejected based on whether it meets someone else's standards. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. My wife, Caroline. She was gentle and kind and everything good in this world. And when she died, I told myself I'd never dishonor her memory by treating another woman with anything less than the respect she deserved. But that's exactly what I was about to do to you. Temperance pulled the quilt up around her shoulders, suddenly aware of how exposed she still was, how vulnerable. So what happens now? Her voice was small. If we don't consummate the marriage, it's not legal. I'll have to leave. You'll have wasted your money, and I'll have nowhere to go. Dalton was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkness beyond the window. Snow had started to fall, fat white flakes drifting past the glass like ghosts. What do you want to happen, Temperance? No one had ever asked her that before, not in any of her marriages. Not in any moment of her entire adult life. She stopped, her throat tight. What did she want? Safety, certainly. A home, food and warmth, and the basic dignity of not being homeless and destitute. But was that all? I want to stop being afraid, she finally said. I want to sleep one night without wondering when everything's going to fall apart again. I want to be useful instead of burdensome. She couldn't finish. You want someone to choose you, Dalton said quietly. Not out of obligation or convenience or desperation, but because they actually want you to stay. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Yes. He nodded slowly. then moved back to the bed. But instead of climbing onto it, he knelt down beside it so his face was level with hers. Up close, she could see how tired he was, how grief had carved him hollow, and loneliness had filled the empty spaces with nothing but duty and survival. "I can't promise you love," he said. "I don't know if I have that left in me anymore. But I can promise you honesty and respect and partnership. I can promise that I won't touch you until you want me to, and that when it happens, if it happens, it'll be because we both chose it, not because some law or contract says we have to." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she didn't, he took her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and solid and real. "I need help on this ranch. You need a home. That's where we start. Everything else we figure out as we go. Does that sound acceptable to you?" Temperance looked down at their joined hands, her pale fingers dwarfed by his darker, work-worn ones, and felt something shift in her chest. It wasn't love. It wasn't even attraction, not yet. But it was the first honest moment she'd had with another human being in longer than she could remember. "Yes," she whispered. "That sounds acceptable." The morning came too early, gray winter light filtering through frost-covered windows that turned the bedroom into a cave of ice and shadows. Temperance woke to the sound of boots on wood and the smell of coffee, bitter and strong enough to strip paint. She sat up quickly, disoriented, then remembered. The wedding, the frozen moment, the promise made by lamplight that had felt like salvation and terror wrapped together. She dressed quickly in the cold, her fingers clumsy on buttons and laces, and emerged from the bedroom to find Dalton already at the stove, his back to her. He'd been up for hours judging by the way he moved, purposeful, efficient, a man who'd learned long ago that sentiment was a luxury Montana winters didn't allow. "Coffee's ready," he said without turning around. "Eggs and bacon in 5 minutes. We've got 30 head of cattle to check, fences to mend on the north pasture, and the barn roof's got a leak that'll bring the whole damn thing down if we get more snow." He finally looked at her, his expression neutral. "You said you could work. Time to prove it." No good morning. No awkwardness about last night. Just straight into business, like the moment of vulnerability between them had been sealed away behind the same walls he kept around everything else. Temperance poured herself coffee in a tin cup, the heat bleeding through the metal into her palms. "What do you need me to do first?" "Eat, then dress warm. I've got spare work clothes that'll fit you better than that." He nodded at her dress. "Caroline was smaller than you, but I've got my old clothes from before I filled out. They'll work." They ate in silence. The scrape of forks on plates, the only sound besides the wind howling around the cabin's corners. Temperance watched him between bites, the way he moved with contained energy, like a man who'd forgotten how to be still. She wondered if he'd slept at all, or if he'd spent the night in the loft staring at darkness and regretting his moment of conscience. When they finished, he pulled out a bundle of clothes, wool pants, a flannel shirt worn soft with age, a heavy coat with patches at the elbows. "Change in the bedroom. Meet me at the barn when you're ready." The clothes fit better than anything she'd worn in years. Men's clothing was made for bodies that took up space, that worked and moved and didn't apologize for existing. She caught her reflection in the small mirror above the dresser and barely recognized herself. A tall, broad-shouldered figure who looked capable instead of apologetic. Outside, the cold hit like a fist to the chest. Snow covered everything in white silence, broken only by the dark shapes of cattle clustered near the barn. Dalton was already there, pitching hay with mechanical precision, his breath coming in white clouds. "Grab that pitchfork," he called when he saw her. "Cattle need feeding before we ride out to check the herd." Temperance had mucked stables before, had helped with harvest crews, had done every kind of backbreaking labor desperate women did to survive. But this was different. This was her work now, her responsibility, her future being built with every forkful of hay. She worked beside Dalton in silence, matching his rhythm, and when he glanced over at her, she caught something in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or reassessment. "You weren't lying about being able to work," he said after an hour, when they'd finished feeding and were saddling horses for the ride out to the pasture. "I don't lie," she said simply. "There's no point. The truth always comes out eventually." He stopped, his hands stilling on the saddle cinch. "No, I suppose it does." He looked at her across the horse's back. "Last night, when you told me about your marriages, did you tell me everything? Or is there more truth waiting to come out?" Temperance considered lying, considered protecting herself, then remembered his words. Honesty and respect and partnership. "There's more," she admitted. "Benjamin, my first husband, he was kind to me, but he was also 40 years older and needed a nurse more than a wife. His family paid me to marry him because they didn't want to care for him themselves. When he died, they kept everything and gave me nothing. Horace married me because he thought my size meant I'd be easy to control, that I'd be grateful enough not to complain when he couldn't perform. And Marcus married me to hide what he really was, and when his secret came out, the scandal touched me too. No respectable family would hire me after that. The charity agency was my last option." She swallowed hard. "So yes, I can work, but I'm also damaged goods, Mr. Fairweather. I come with scandal and failure and 3 families who wanted nothing to do with me. If you want to reconsider—" "Stop," he interrupted. "Stop apologizing for other people's failures. Stop calling yourself damaged because broken men couldn't see what they had." He led his horse toward her, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head up to meet his eyes. "I told you last night, I can't promise love, but I can promise I won't punish you for crimes you didn't commit. You're here now. This is your home, and anyone who says different will answer to me." Something warm unfurled in Temperance's chest, dangerous and frightening and too fragile to trust. But she nodded, not trusting her voice. They rode out together into the white silence of Montana winter, 2 damaged people looking for redemption in frozen ground and struggling cattle and the hard work of survival. 3 weeks passed like a fever dream of exhaustion and routine. Temperance woke before dawn, worked until her hands bled, fell into bed too tired to dream. She learned the rhythm of the ranch, the cattle's needs, the fence lines that always needed mending, the way Montana wind could cut through 3 layers of wool and still find skin. And she learned Dalton Fairweather in fragments, pieces of a man revealed not through words, but through action. The way he always poured her coffee first, how he'd leave extra firewood by the stove on the coldest nights. The careful distance he maintained, never touching her except when necessary, never entering the bedroom while she was changing, never asking for anything beyond partnership and work. They were strangers living as spouses, business partners playing at marriage, and it should have been enough. It should have been more than she'd ever had before. But on Christmas Eve, when she found him standing alone in the barn, staring at a wooden cradle tucked in the corner under dusty blankets, she realized it wasn't distance keeping them apart. It was grief so deep it had become his entire identity. "I made that for my daughter," Dalton said quietly, not turning around even though he must have heard her approach. His voice was hollow, scraped raw. "Spent 6 months getting the joints perfect, sanding it smooth so there'd be no splinters. Caroline would sit beside me in the evenings, sewing blankets and singing hymns. She said our daughter would be born in spring, that we'd name her Rose because that's when the wild roses bloom in the valley." He reached out and touched the cradle's edge, his hand trembling. "She never got to use it, never even got to see it finished. She died on a February night screaming my name, begging me to save them both, and I couldn't do a damn thing except watch them slip away. Temperance's throat closed. She'd known he was a widower, known he'd lost a child, but knowing facts and understanding grief were different things entirely. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and the words felt pathetically inadequate. "Everyone's sorry." Dalton's laugh was bitter. The doctor was sorry. The preacher was sorry. The neighbors were sorry. But sorry doesn't bring them back. Sorry doesn't make me less alone. Sorry doesn't... His voice cracked and he stopped, his shoulders hunching forward like he was trying to fold in on himself. Temperance did something she'd never done before. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him from behind, her cheek pressed against his back, her body offering the only comfort she had to give. He went rigid at first, every muscle locked tight, and she thought he'd pull away, reject her touch the way he'd rejected everything else that felt too much like intimacy. But then something broke in him. His hands came up to grip her arms, holding her against him like she was the only solid thing in a world that had stopped making sense, and he made a sound that was half sob, half prayer. They stood like that for a long time, two broken people holding each other up in a barn that smelled of hay and horses and old grief. Outside, snow fell silent and thick, covering the world in white forgiveness. "I don't know how to stop missing her," Dalton finally said, his voice raw and honest in a way she'd never heard before. "I don't know how to be anything but the man she left behind." "Maybe you don't have to stop," Temperance said quietly. "Maybe you just have to learn how to live anyway." He turned in her arms then, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw his face completely unguarded. No walls, no distance, just devastating vulnerability and exhaustion that went bone deep. "I'm scared," he admitted. "I'm scared that if I let myself care about someone again, I'll lose them too. I'm scared that everything I touch turns to death and dust. I'm scared that you'll realize what a mess I am and leave, and I'll be alone again in this cabin with nothing but ghosts and regrets." "I'm scared too," she confessed. "I'm scared you'll wake up one day and see me the way other men have. Too big, too much, too broken to love. I'm scared this is just another marriage that'll end with me on the street with nothing. I'm scared." Her voice broke. "I'm scared I'll never be enough for anyone." Dalton reached up and cupped her face in his work-roughened hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "You're enough," he said fiercely. "You're more than enough. And I'm sorry it took me 3 weeks to tell you that. I'm sorry I've been keeping you at arm's length like you were just hired help instead of my wife. I'm sorry." She kissed him. She didn't plan it, didn't think about it, just closed the distance between them and pressed her lips to his, because words had failed them both, and maybe action was all they had left. He froze for half a heartbeat, then kissed her back with desperate hunger, his arms wrapping around her waist and pulling her closer, closer, until there was no space left between them at all. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dalton rested his forehead against hers. "I can't promise this won't be hard," he said. "I can't promise I won't mess it up, or that my grief won't sometimes make me impossible to live with. But I can promise I'll try. I can promise I see you, Temperance. All of you. And I want you to stay. I want to stay," she whispered back. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I choose this. I choose you. I choose us." The bedroom felt different now. Not a place of obligation or fear, but a sanctuary they'd chosen together. Dalton led Temperance inside, his hand warm and steady around hers, the lamp casting golden light across the brass bed that had haunted her nightmares for 3 weeks. But tonight there were no commands, no clinical examinations, no frozen moments of horror. Tonight there was just a man and a woman who decided that broken pieces could still fit together if you were patient enough to find the right angles. "We don't have to do anything," Dalton said, his voice gentle. "We can just sleep, just be together without—" "I want to," Temperance interrupted. "Not because the law requires it, or because you paid for a mail-order bride, but because I want to know what it feels like to be chosen. I want to know what it feels like to be wanted." She reached up and touched his face, tracing the lines grief had carved there. "I want you, Dalton Fairweather, scars and ghosts and all." He kissed her then, slow and deep and reverent, like she was something precious instead of something discarded. His hands were steady as he helped her out of her clothes, steady as he laid her down on the bed, steady as he whispered promises against her skin. "I'll be gentle. I'll go slow. Tell me if anything hurts. You're beautiful. God, you're so beautiful." And when he finally joined their bodies together, when she felt the sharp, bright pain of becoming his wife in truth, and not just name, she didn't cry out in fear or regret. She cried out in relief, because this, finally, was what it felt like to be whole. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the worn quilt, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. Outside, church bells rang midnight, Christmas morning arriving with fresh snow and new beginnings. "I love you," Dalton said suddenly, fiercely, like the words had been locked inside him and finally broken free. "I know I said I couldn't promise that, but I was wrong. I love you, Temperance. Not because you work hard, or because you're useful, or because you fill an empty space. I love you because you're brave and honest and kind despite every reason you have not to be. I love you because when I look at you, I don't just see my present, I see my future." Temperance's tears came hot and fast, soaking into his chest. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't think I could. I didn't think I had it in me after everything. But I do. I love you so much it terrifies me." "Then we'll be terrified together," he said, and she heard the smile in his voice. "We'll be terrified and damaged and struggling and alive. We'll build this ranch back up. We'll survive winters and droughts and whatever else Montana throws at us. And maybe someday, if you want, we'll fill that cradle in the barn with a child who'll know they were wanted, who'll grow up watching their parents choose each other every single day." Temperance lifted her head to look at him, this lonely rancher who'd frozen in horror at the evidence of her pain and chosen tenderness over entitlement. "You really want that? A family? With me?" "With you," he confirmed. "Only with you. You're not my second choice, or my replacement wife, or my mail-order convenience. You're Temperance Fairweather, and you're the best decision I ever made." She kissed him again, and this time there was no desperation, no fear, just the quiet certainty of two people who'd found home in each other. Outside, Christmas morning broke cold and clear over Montana territory, and inside a small cabin 40 miles from anywhere, a giant mail-order bride and a lonely rancher held each other close and dared to believe in second chances. 3 months later, Temperance stood in the kitchen kneading bread while Dalton fixed the perpetually leaking barn roof, and she caught herself humming, actually humming, like happiness was something she'd earned the right to express. The ranch was doing better. They'd saved 15 calves during a late spring blizzard. They'd mended all the fences. They'd planted a garden that was already showing green shoots. And at night, they fell into bed exhausted and satisfied, wrapped around each other like they'd been doing this for decades instead of months. She was home. Finally, impossibly, completely home. Not because a man had ordered her from a catalog, or because desperation had driven her west, or because she had nowhere else to go, but because she'd chosen to stay, and he'd chosen to see her, and together they'd built something real from the wreckage of their broken pasts. The door opened, and Dalton came in, his face flushed from work, sawdust in his hair. He crossed to her immediately, wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, and pressed a kiss to her neck. "Bread smells good," he murmured. "But not as good as you." Temperance laughed, the sound surprising her with its lightness. "You're covered in sawdust and smell like horse." "Don't sweet-talk me." "I'll sweet-talk you whenever I damn well please, Mrs. Fairweather. You're my wife and I love you, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never forget it." He spun her around to face him. "Speaking of which, I have something to tell you." Her heart jumped. "What?" "I've been saving money. The cattle sales went better than expected. And I was thinking—" He paused, suddenly looking nervous. "I was thinking maybe we could expand, buy more land, build a bigger house, make this ranch into something our children will inherit someday." He placed his hand over her still flat stomach. "That is, if you're willing to give me children, if you want that." Temperance covered his hand with hers, tears blurring her vision. "I want that," she whispered. "I want everything with you." And as the Montana sun streamed through the window of their small cabin, as bread rose on the counter and horses nickered in the barn and the future stretched out before them full of possibility, Temperance Fairweather, the giant mail-order bride who'd been married 3 times and never been touched, finally understood what it meant to be loved. Not despite her size or her past or her scars, but because of everything she was and everything she'd survived to become. She was enough. She'd always been enough. She just needed someone brave enough to see it. If this story touched your heart, hit that notification bell right now so you never miss another powerful story like this one. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. We love hearing from viewers all around the world. Your story matters, just like Temperance's did. Don't forget to subscribe, and remember, you are enough, exactly as you are.
Once again, Tales from the Wild West sends a huge thank you to all of you. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to keep creating. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.